So I'm Sean Kensing. I am a recovery coach and life coach. I got connected to Zach in kind of a funny way because Stanton Peele showed up in my neighborhood in Brooklyn one day. And because have been interested for a few years in harm reduction and progressive approaches to helping people, I knew who Stanton Peele was, of course, because anyone who's interested in that sort of thing has heard of him, certainly. And I would see him around my neighborhood, and I was like, I really think that's Stanton Peele. I remember saying to my wife, I think that's Stanton Peele, the harm reduction guy that he's written all those books. I really think that's him. And I eventually ended up finding him on Facebook and connected with Zach through him. And then since have had the wonderful opportunity of hanging out with you guys and getting to know Stanton a bit. And yeah, so now that's what I'm doing here, and that's why we're talking.
Good to know you, Sean.
You too, man. Really good to know you. I wondered if I could run some questions by you about LPP, some from a bit of a faux devil's advocate perspective. Maybe I shouldn't reveal that, but I think it makes more sense to reveal it because it'll be obvious that I'm playing a part of the skeptic.
Sure.
Really, I resonate with LPP pretty strongly in the way I work with people. But then I have some questions that are pretty genuine too, that in reading through the text you shared with me, I've got some questions to ask about that too. But the place I want to start is from the total devil's advocate perspective, someone who's looking at this saying 12-step or the medical disease model are the answers to addiction. This guy Stanton Peele's a nut. This guy Zach is a nut. This guy Sean's probably a nut. They're wrong. And I think someone from that perspective, one of the things they might ask on the subject of values, right? Because you talk a lot in LPP about values, helping someone identify their values, and then sort of using those to build a recovery on. I imagine someone from the world of either medical disease model or 12-step or both, because they have that unholy alliance, might say, how can a quote unquote actively addicted person clearly assess their values, right? How can a person in that state really make heads or tails of what their values even might be, let alone are?
All right. So if I were coming from a debate perspective, I might say something like the onus would be on the questioner to tell me why something like addiction or drugs or whatever it is would play by a different set of rules than the rest of life. And because we sort of act, at least like in the rest of life, if we are not living in accordance with our values, that we can still muster a plan and to figure out how to identify them, live them, and create goals so that we're more aligned with them than we were before. Values meaning things that are important to us, that we believe that if we were living according to them, that our lives would be genuinely better. So, but that's not why you didn't want to have a conversation for like a straw man debate. So I think the real answer to that is that, well, it's sort of how I said it tacitly in my last answer. I think drug use is not something that plays by a different set of rules. Then again, inherent in your question is somebody from the perspective that it does. And I guess I'd say that we would have to look first at the fact that if you really assess what's going on when somebody becomes addicted or overcomes addiction, which happens all the time, if we're in the same realm, then we could say that does happen at least. But really the data show that most people do. People take drugs all the time, and kind of a minuscule, compared to the number who actually take drugs, a minuscule number of people become addicted to them, enough that it puts someone like you or me in a position to be in a job, but not enough that it actually makes a huge statistical dent on a map of survey data. But of course, okay, so a small percentage of an enormous number is still a big number. And so a lot of people become addicted, meaning that they live in a way that they sort of rely on an involvement to give them some pleasure, sense of relief that they felt like they couldn't generate some other way. And so when that happens, they get into a cyclical kind of behavior, just like someone might with the relationship. You know, you would form a relationship with a drug, or you form a relationship with a, you know, a bad involvement that you think you need to lean on, and you start relying on it to do more than it actually could possibly do. So when someone does that, if they're of the belief system that this thing that they're leaning on, let's just call it drugs or alcohol. If they're of the belief system that the sole source of gratification in their lives comes from a drug or comes from alcohol, then they're going to leave behind some of the things that they knew before made life important to them. Maybe it's relationships or employment and things like that. And you know, you've seen people go to the extent that either they say, God, this thing's really getting me in trouble. I can't hold a job and drink all this much at the same time. So I've got to really figure something out. How can I reconcile this? And that's how people self-correct all the time. And when people don't, you know, enough happens in their lives that they say, obviously things are destructive, and obviously I don't want to be on this track, but I don't know where to go. I don't know where to point myself. And that's where someone like you as a recovery and life coach, or me who does the same kind of work, would say, let's just try to figure out some fundamental values in your life. If only you could have them, how would it make your life better? And from that place, you can say, well, I might not be able to sort all this stuff out right now, but I know I could do something today that could get me slightly closer to where I want to be than, let's say, yesterday or a week ago. And to me, that's sort of like, I almost want to say that's the kind of advice that's so fundamental and common sense that it's almost not even really advice. I feel silly sometimes giving it, or I feel like someone's going to think I'm patronizing them if I offer it. So I believe that's the case. I believe that's the case with drugs or alcohol or any sort of relationship that somebody can form. I don't think that drugs and alcohol play by a different set of rules. And I think the data pours that out. And of course, my anecdotal experiences play that out as well. That is a reasonable answer.
Yeah, believe me, that was a great answer. Yeah, and I think, well, you spoke to a lot there. One thing I heard in there, correct me if I'm wrong, is this sort of idea that, like, let's stop pretending addiction is such a unique experience that it sort of, you know, turns the natural laws of the universe on its head, right? That
right.
Entering into that sort of agreement with a person kind of perpetuates the impossibility that anything could ever change. Whereas someone coming in and sort of saying, well, what if your experience makes total sense and is actually sort of, yeah, complicated, but not like, you know, beyond the pale, complicated, but something we can be curious about. And sort of almost having that trust that a person can always sort of, no matter what the state they're in, connect to some basic values. Yeah, all of that was great. I mean, I have a follow-up question that's even more sort of devil's advocate-y, because I know what the answer is, but I'm curious to just hear if you have any experience with this kind of thing. Have you ever found a person sort of unable to do values work? Have you ever found a person where, for whatever reason, whether it was their altered state was so extreme, or their maybe depression or anxiety symptoms were so extreme, have you ever found somebody where it just was sort of like, I feel like we can't get there in some way?
Well, I've never met somebody who I truly believe can't get there, but I've certainly spoken to people who themselves feel like maybe they can't, or who are reluctant to engage in the exercise because any step they might make is a small step and their problems are catastrophic and big ones. So it's like a drop in a bucket. And so how can my small, slight effort justify, how is my effort justified? You know, if I'm trying to run a marathon and I walk around the block one day, do I really feel like I've done something when everything's so painful? And what I do in that situation is help sort of explore the alternative to that. I mean, I wouldn't convince somebody to do something if they want to do nothing, but then again, they've already done something by speaking with me. So, you know, may as well just extend the headache for a second and try to figure out, well, what is it that you're up to by calling me or talking to me? Who put you up to this? And if no one, then it was you. And what do you think you might get out of this? And so if you know, when I bounce back and forth the ideas with people, that it is possible and it might take some time to do something that puts you in a better position than you were. I understand the reluctance. Of course, it happens. It's happened to me a trillion times. It happens to me with sort of normal involvements daily, actually.
Same here.
Yeah, right. And at the same time, I think we had a long conversation about that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, at some point, you need to act. You need to do something, and you could act. You know, if you can really think about counterfactuals or two different thought experiments. You know, I could do the same thing I've been doing, and I might even engage somebody in a conversation about that. What does that look like? And if you do nothing to stop whatever the cycle is, if you just did nothing at all, what would happen? And I wouldn't do that in a baiting way. I wouldn't say, well, don't you think that if you did nothing at all, that something horrible will happen? But I might ask, let's just play this out. If you just, let's say you hang up with me and it's like, you decide this thing is a problem, like you've just told me, but you don't do anything about it. What might happen? Sometimes people talk themselves into a scenario where they say, well, that's actually impossible for me to do nothing at all. Like eventually something would come to a head and I would have to figure something out. And sometimes people would say, you know, something horrible will happen if I don't do anything about it. So the motivation is there. And if the motivation is there in that moment, and you can make two choices, one perpetuates the cycle and one moves you away from it, it can begin to justify the effort, especially if you're sort of talking it out with somebody who you feel like you can trust.
So somebody who's not sort of pasting this comprehensive explanation over you, but is actually sort of being curious about you and reasonable. And
I think so. And I know, I know that's sort of how you feel too. But yeah, the last thing you want is to think, all right, I'm going to give it my all. I'm going to try this thing. I hope I don't fail. And I hope you don't watch me fail. You know, you want to be given the opportunity to just figure it out and experiment.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
And by the way, I just thought of a better thing to say about your last question, because I know you know Peele, and so I don't know if you're familiar with his first book, Love and Addiction.
You know, it's funny because I haven't read it yet, and it's like very much on my list. I own it, and I think now is the time for me to delve into it. But go ahead.
I just gotta say, it's evergreen. I mean, Peele writes about addiction, but addiction as he defines it is just sort of, they're really just books about human nature. And they'll last forever. I mean, the times will change, our resources might change, but the things he writes about are forever. And so when he talks about love addiction, people used to laugh him off the stage when he would be talking about it, even though it was a bestseller. And it stemmed from this experience that he had when he was in college. I'm giving away a little bit of his memoir here, but I think he has already done it. Where he and his college friend and colleague, Archie Brodsky, they knew a guy who, you know, is pretty pro-social guy. And then he got into this relationship with a woman, and she was backstepping in the relationship, but he had already decided that he needed to clutch this relationship, whatever it was that he was seeking from it. Maybe he wanted to be wanted, or maybe she had something that he felt he couldn't get somewhere else. He decided that he needed the relationship, and he chased it, even though she was trying to back away. And he chased it to the extent that he blocked out the friendships, work involvements, anything like that, because he was obsessed. He was obsessed with her in a way, you know, a healthy love relationship would be something like, I want to thrive and I want you to thrive, and I would love if we could thrive together. His thing was like, I don't care really what happens to you, as long as we can be together. I need you and I need to be together with you. And she eventually broke up with him. And when she did that, he committed suicide. And he understood the thing that his friend was going through. He was devastated at this loss, and he realized the thing he experienced, that was an addiction. And when at the same time as Peele says love addiction in a lot of ways, it's the worst one of all, because it's not inanimate object, even if it's one, like people with drug addictions. Drugs could be a pretty powerful source of well-being, I guess, in a moment, but it involves another person who is maybe unpredictable and you have to negotiate with. And so you can get really wrapped up in a love relationship, and to the extent that more people seem to commit suicide and do, self-harm kind of things to themselves over it than with other things. Anyway, when you talk to somebody about a love relationship and you ask, well, this guy has been in bad relationships, could he ever love again? You're much more likely to get people saying, of course he can love it. I mean, just he'll figure it out. He'll find somebody right for him or whatever, or if you're a friend and you ask somebody, I've been in these terrible relationships and I've been chasing, they might say, well, what were you chasing after all? I mean, maybe you want to go after somebody for these reasons instead of those reasons and so you can have a normal conversation about it. And for one reason or another, just something that's been embedded in our societal conversations about what drugs are, we can't have those conversations about drug use or alcohol use.
That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you sharing that. There's this kind of assumption that the addicted person, particularly or specifically when it comes to substances, is sort of like incapable of rational thought,
right?
Which is a pretty aggressive assumption when you really think about it. But it's like so commonplace in sort of mainstream addiction treatment. It's really aggressive, but it's like been sort of so normalized. I'm curious, can I ask a follow-up question about what you just shared?
Yeah.
How would something like LPP, something that's based on sort of motivational principles and in large part on cognitive behavioral therapy and things like that, and I obviously I want to be respectful here. We don't necessarily need to talk about Stanton's friend specifically, but when I'm thinking about values, right, and I'm thinking about sort of fundamentally deep down, we all have values, whether we acknowledge them or not. Maybe some we act in opposition to for some reason, some are dormant, etc. In the case of someone who is, moved to end their own life, which obviously we know happens often in cases of addiction, whether it's substance or otherwise, what are we to make of what happened there in terms of values? In other words, is there a notion that an involvement can be of such intensity that values are almost powerless in the face of it? And if so, I mean, I know I just used the dirty P word that, that the 12-step world is so obsessed with powerless, but what do we make of the notion of, well, if deep down this person surely values, let's say life, for example, maybe that's not an assumption we can make. I don't know, but I'm curious how a sort of LPP framework would conceive of something like suicide.
Well, okay. Well, the idea is, of course, I'm not trying to be tongue in cheek or silly or anything. The idea of course, is not to drive someone to suicide, or someone not to enter into a belief system that's so bleak that they feel like that's the only option. So I'll actually turn that around. The whole powerlessness idea. Well, you usually have to help people feel more powerless when they're in an engagement like that. Like, I don't know his friend. I don't know any more about it than I just said, and I probably already screwed up the story. But we know people who are like that, or at least maybe they haven't gotten to such a dark end, but who have entered cycles like that, and maybe it's even you or me. And the thing is, I could probably make the assumption that there's something important in that person's life. Like, if you really thought about it, there probably is something important about meaningful work and friendships. But I think he started believing that those things became secondary to this other thing that he felt he needed. And LPP would ask a person who has such a destructive relationship, or just a relationship that they're having trouble understanding, that they know is kind of problematic. We would ask, what sensations are you seeking? And do you get that sensation in other ways? Only through the drug? Do you get it other ways? If you were to get it in other ways, if only you could like muster the skills or the whatever, the time or the motivation, what do you think they would be? What are some other ways people have? And so the idea is to get people thinking beyond sort of the narrow-minded kind of belief system that they seem to have entered into, where they feel like they are powerless, and to remind them that there is more to life that they've probably already created. And so it's not like getting someone to believe something else or conjuring a value when a value wasn't there. It's more bringing to surface and reminding and sort of having a dialogue with people so that they remember why life is important to them.
And obviously, despite, I mean, as you said, like, you're not being tongue in cheek when you say that, like, we don't want people to lose their lives and we don't want people to take their own lives.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not making fun of I don't think AA wants people to lose their lives.
Sure.
In other
sure.
words. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, totally. And I think, it's part of what I think is sort of scary about that. In general, I don't mean from a 12-step perspective or LPP, but just scary is the idea that, common sense can help people even in very, very desperate situations. And sometimes they just don't, for one reason or another, connect with it, right? And that's a scary thing to sort of confront as helping professionals. Obviously, it's a scary thing to confront as human beings, this idea that, for whatever complex web of reasons, sometimes people either don't connect with the sort of, aren't able for some reason to connect or can't clearly connect with these deeper values that might turn them away from not only addictive entanglements, but obviously also self-harm or suicide. I mean, in a certain sense, I'm seeking an answer to a question that doesn't really have an answer, right? I mean, sometimes horrible things happen and we can't exactly say why or even get close to saying why. But I was just curious about that idea of sort of, is there a person who's sort of unreachable? And, my sense is no, although there are people who are tremendously alienated and reaching them is quite difficult, maybe. But the sense I'm getting from you, and tell me if I'm putting this right, is this sort of, kind of being with people in a really patient, curious way can start in first contact, right? Like, in other words, you're having trouble figuring out your values. Like, I get it. Things are really confusing right now. Maybe we don't have to do that today. Maybe we could just do this. Maybe we could, but just like fostering a relationship rather than sort of like gunning to exorcise the addiction or the bad feelings or whatever it might be.
Yeah, the thing is, in almost every situation that someone's seeking help, I mean, inherent in that phrase, seeking help, they are seeking something. And I think the job of a really good clinician is to help them just unravel that thread on their own about what they're seeking and why and what it would get them if they got it, without putting one's own values on them or one's own advice on them, especially unsolicited. Yeah.
So, first of all, do you feel like you're being interrogated, or can I throw another couple of questions at you?
No, go.
I know that you have a special aptitude, special talent for working with young people. And part of the reason I know that is because, as you know, Stanton is very generous with his compliments, and he'll when he introduces people, this is one of the things I love about Stanton. When he introduces people, he tells them both what's great about the other one. Right? He sort of says, I'm introducing you to Zach because he's this brilliant guy who has this gift working with young people and just thinking about change in general. And he'll, give his little spiel about the amazing things about you, which is really a beautiful quality that he has that I really appreciate. But anyway, I know that you have that sort of special aptitude and ability to connect with kids and young people. And I think that's related to the question I was going to ask next about values, which is, if you look at somebody in an addictive experience, right, there's a common sense to the idea of saying, well, clearly this person values, let's say, pleasure, right? Or if you want to get a little bit more introspective and kind of a little bit more rich about it, maybe this person values escape on some level, or values kind of, you know, managing their experience of life with substances. And so the question I was going to ask is, and I would imagine this might be something you encounter with young people who are maybe have a chip on their shoulder, maybe have been sort of stomped on by other quote unquote helpers in their history, maybe a bit alienated, maybe a bit closed off. I could imagine in a discussion of values with either a young person in that position or maybe even an adult who is similarly alienated, there could be this sort of brick wall of, yeah, I value, you want to talk to me about values? I value pleasure and I value escape. Those are the things I value most. You know, that's where I'm at, you know? And again, I'm thinking mostly of a young person here, but sort of trying to push up against that and maybe getting a lot of alienation, sort of, you know, get away from me type of experience, which of course, as you said before, well, if the person's there talking to you, clearly some part of them doesn't exactly want you to go away. But there can often be that sort of brick wall of, yeah, if you want to talk to me about values, I value the things this substance gives me, right? How do you sort of try to work with that from an LPP perspective?
All right. So I do work with the young people, and I think my best work that I do with them involves a series of interactions, none of which seem clinical. In other words, I actually hate doing clinical work. I sort of hate doing one-on-one stuff. Some people like it, and to that end, okay, I'll enjoy it too. But something about kids is that they still have there's still part of the expectation of them that they'll play, or they'll like engage like a kid, or that they're still developing to do. Let's say some people are a little bit more closed-minded about the fact that adults continue to develop over the lifespan. But so there are things that especially kids do, I think, that demonstrate how they will work on something even if it pains them, because they care about the result of the thing, or they care about what's going to happen next. People will go through, like I wrote in the book, there's a guy who he didn't want to write at all because he felt like that was just way too much effort. And at the same time, he would spend hours and hours up all night sometimes drawing comics, which involved higher order thinking, and they were hilarious. Some were inappropriate, absolutely hilarious. He worked really, really hard on that, but he didn't identify that as work. There's something there that I don't need to really say. I don't need to tell him that or convince him that there's something that he values. He's already demonstrating it. He maybe hadn't put it in that perspective before. So that job entailed saying, oh, you do this thing, and you work hard at it, and because you work hard at it, you develop this thing. And I wonder if you've ever known this. You know, a lot of people do this for a living. Like it makes them money, and it makes them gives them status in the world. And so this guy who would never write anything in my civics class drew political cartoons. And then after he drew political cartoons, he and I worked together to put them into a book. And when we put them into a book unprompted, he started writing the stories behind all of them. So we did more writing than anybody in the class. And it was because there was something that motivated him more than the writing itself. Now, I'm not saying that's talking more about motivation than values. But what I am saying is that put in perspective and believe, when you put everything in perspective and believing that some effort was justified because something that he valued could come of it, got him to do something. So sometimes it's like people aren't living their values, or they're dormant because they feel like, yes, a life of good value would look like this if only I could accomplish it. It's just that I don't think I can accomplish it. So now I only value these second, third tier things. So that's what we do in LPP as well. It's sort of asking people questions and having conversations with them so that they can articulate their life experience, more than just their problems, but just what they're up to in life, in such a way that maybe we could reframe some things that were either non-conversation starters to them before, or things that they thought were problems, but even if they are, maybe they had some benefit as well. Just reformulate that a little bit and play around with those variables so that they can plug into some channel that helps them move forward and recognize that, oh, maybe it is worth this after all. A more concrete answer to the question would be, there are a series of questions that we ask people, having them list every single one of their values, or list, if you can, all the things that you value in life. And it gets from, really deep, like love, honesty, to things like, well, what you said, like pleasure, or sometimes people write getting fucked up, or, things like that. And, okay, it's true, you could value all those things. And then we ask people to narrow it down, and we start sort of phasing into questions that say, things like, what's a value that totally opposes your addiction? And what are 3 things that you value the absolute most? Or what's one thing you would never want to lose? And talking that way and getting people to actually answer honestly can put me or a coach or a clinician in a position to say, look, if you put that all together here, what you're kind of telling me is, and then now you have, a platter of values that a person maybe hadn't articulated before.
Gotcha. I really love the idea that that a dormant value, because I was going to sort of ask about that phrase, which I love. I really love the way, if I heard you right, or if I understood you right, the idea that a dormant value is one that sort of you perhaps no longer believe you can fulfill, right? Or live up to, or achieve, or whatever. That there's this sort of, it's almost a crisis of confidence, or a sort of, a lack of belief in oneself or something. And if that can be sort of plugged back together, the value becomes active again rather than dormant, right? Like if I believe I can live in accordance to this, or get it, whatever that means.
If you believe you can, or if you believe you're worth, if you're worth the effort in trying to, or that if you try and don't succeed in the way that you've sort of fantasized about, that it's not going to kill you. It is all about belief, and it's all about, optimism, I guess. It just, the idea that you got to try and it's worth trying. So one way or another, people locked into addictions or not wanting to pursue more fruitful channels usually either have a sort of belief system that they can't, or they shouldn't, or it's scary to, or something. And so, rendering people slightly more optimistic is a boon.
Yeah. All right. I got one more.
Okay. Oh, good.
On this subject of values. And it's a bit of a complicated one, but I think I can ask it clearly. So if you take, a person you're working with might at some point say something like, I know I should be living in accordance with my highest values or deepest values, same thing, but either I can't or I won't. Some people might say both. Some people might say I can't or I won't, or I can't even tell whether it's can't or won't. Some people might gravitate more towards one or the other of those words, that I can't sort of live off of my deepest values, or I seem to just not be willing to, right? So no matter how many times I wake up and say, I can't believe what happened, I can't believe I did X, Y, and Z to whoever, I never want to do this again, etc., and then I continue to do it, that seems to be some kind of indication that I am not willing to live according to my values. And despite how painful that is, I continue to do it, right? And I'm thinking, which obviously describes addiction as well as many other like unpleasant psychological states or involvements. And I'm thinking that idea of stuckness, right? And that experience of a person saying, I either can't do X, Y, and Z, or I seem to be unwilling to do X, Y, and Z. There's probably hundreds of different ways of conceiving of that. But the three I'm thinking of is you have the disease model, and the disease model and the 12-step model have that kind of weird entanglement, even though they're not exactly the same thing, but they get sort of like lumped together in this really bizarre way. That world, either from a medical perspective or a 12-step perspective, might say, you're exactly right, that you can't live in accordance with your highest values because you are experiencing this phenomenon called addiction. The medical view might say, therefore, you need abstinence because your brain sort of can't handle its relationship with substances, or maybe you need certain kinds of medication. The 12-step perspective would say you need abstinence, certainly, and you need spirituality, some kind of relationship with a higher power, to sort of accommodate or make up for what you lack as an addicted person, or how you're afflicted as an addicted person. That's one way to look at that experience of stuckness, right? The disease or 12-step models would say, you are stuck. We have the answer to your stuckness, whether it's a medical one or a sort of psycho-spiritual one. A second way to look at that would be more from the, I guess the word I would use is psychotherapeutic lens, right? Which would be, that's obviously massively complicated, and there's many, many different perspectives. But in general, I think the psychotherapy, it's fair to say that psychotherapy accommodates for like the influence of the past, right? So this idea that you may feel intensely stuck, and what might be helpful is if you and I unwind the sort of connection to the past that explains that stuckness, and maybe, depending on the psychotherapy model, magically releases that stuckness once it is explained. Now, full disclosure here, I have some strong sympathies with that second perspective, although I don't think insight magically dissolves anything. In fact, sometimes insight can be even more painful because you're sort of like, I understand it, but it's still happening and nothing is changing. But I do believe that there is value and utility to sort of understanding the experience of stuckness from a, let's say, developmental perspective, or, therapeutic perspective. I'm curious about where LPP falls along those dimensions. I mean, I know enough to know that the first dimension has no real relevance, and it is in fact opposed by LPP. So that one, I think we can sweep off the table relatively easily, unless you want to sweep it off the table with me. But the second one I'm more curious about, this kind of idea of where does LPP stand on the utility of the past and developmental experiences as they influence present behavior?
That was such a beautifully crafted question.
Thank you.
That really hit it all. Well, I'll take it chronologically. First, I'm not trying to play a semantic game, but it's important. You mentioned a hypothetical person that might say, well, I should be living according to my values, but And shout out to a friend of mine, Damon Jacobs, who wrote a book called Absolutely Shouldless. Anyway, there's a very much Albert Ellis perspective that the term or the idea of I should is generally toxic.
Nice.
The idea is that's the term should is actually, it carries a lot of baggage with it. Like, should, why, and who says? Do you say? And if you say, why? And in what context? And so I sort of, I buy into that. I don't really think that that's a helpful term, that I should do something. It's more like I would like to. You unravel this a little bit, and you said, wound up saying like, well, I would like to, or I would not like to, or I could, or maybe I couldn't, or something like that. So okay, so you have that dilemma, and you have a model that says either, well, you're right, you really can't, you've gotten yourself in a bind here, you've entered into some sort of a disease, and something about the structure of your brain, there's a brain mechanism that's not firing right. So either, you could do one of two things. You could take a medication, and that'll at least stabilize you to make the best decisions you can under the auspices of the medication, or you can submit to a sort of a higher power and an ideology, for lack of a better term, or a framework, let's say, if you're being charitable, and that framework will at least keep you afloat. Now, it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to stay on that framework all the time and constantly revisit it, but it beats the alternative, which is institution or death. In our eyes, that perspective is like, well, you just took the problem that the person already knows is a problem, and then you added another thing. So that, to me, is just that's out, because you put a ceiling on a person's ability to generate their own best life. And all evidence show it'd be one thing if it were true. I think all evidence shows that there's no reason not to bet on somebody to be able to, given that they have the right resources and skills and ability and motivation and everything. No one can play God and say that some people can and some people can't generate their best lives. So that, as you say, I think that's easy for me to sweep off the table. But at the same time, I don't want to take that as self-evident, because there are going to be a lot of people who might probably already don't like my answer. But, if I just said, well, obviously it's not true, it defeats the purpose of us having the conversation.
Right.
When it comes to psychoanalysis, I think is what you're talking about, and kind of looking at the past. LPP, we don't say, for all the things that people might have said about Stanton, we don't say not to look at your past. In fact, part of our program has people write their life story. And it's a life story that starts out by sort of detailing things about your past and your present, and talking about your issues as well as your, golden times and things that you like, things that you hate, struggles that you have, and we kind of prompt people through it. The part of that life story that's unique, or I guess that distinguishes us from something like 12 steps or a disease model, is that we ask people to revisit it over time. So as the dialogue with a coach and the modules, the exercises that they're doing continue to evolve, we ask them, will you return to your life story now and write the next chapter? And that life story changes over time, and people get to see in real time those changes and how because they're not looking at their past one, but their past informs whatever they say and do in the modules, and then whatever they say and do informs whatever they write next in the life story. So we're sort of helping them develop a new cycle of thought where they're putting effort in something, and it could be like the slightest effort, enough that you have to do something, and not nothing, but slight enough that obviously you could do it. And if you have a checklist for long enough that says, hey, look, I was supposed to tie my shoes every single day, and I did every morning, and look at that, I did it. Check, 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 check. And then you start to talk about it, and then it opens your eyes to things that could have been obvious if you were only looking for the positive in your life. And so we think that, okay, it's important to think about your past, but framing it as a prologue rather than a thing that you need to untie, untangle, and somehow by looking at it, it's going to solve something. I think I can speak for everyone in the program that we see that idea, sort of radical psychoanalysis, let's say, as just another form of a disease model, because you could just untangle your past for infinity. But at some point, you have to put one foot in front of the other and do something, because if you don't, then what's this all about anyway?
Yeah, I mean, so there's this kind of like this idea of sort of revisiting the narrative, owning the narrative in a different way, seeing things in the narrative that you may not have seen from a different vantage point, and this idea that sort of words like should, can't, and won't have a quality or a weight to them that is not necessarily helpful. I mean, obviously in commonplace conversation, they do what they do, but in this world of how do I get out of this difficult entanglement, words like should, can't, and won't maybe are not the most helpful.
And people can use whatever language they want to use. But I would ask them to inspect that a little bit. I would offer that they could inspect it, and that if they did, that maybe they would, maybe it would be something telling for them. So the reason I say that is because people come to the program a lot and will ask, some of the first questions are like, what's the issue, or why are you here? And their answers are, well, I'm an addict, I'm diseased, I'm whatever the thing is that they're supposed to say when they enter a program. It's like they think it's like a patriarchy or something. It's like a club that they're, or a private school they're trying to get into, or you know what I mean? Like they're supposed to be these right answers, and they're just regurgitating them, when we'd really like to tell them every single person has an interesting story. And if you talk to someone and you're not interested in them, you're not asking the right questions, because people are extremely interesting, and we're interesting because we're all so unique. And so when someone gives an answer that they start to say, and you could sort of start saying it at the same time, and you're just saying the same thing, it's so predictable. That's not interesting. That's not what that person thinks is interesting about their lives. And that's not the thing that they think is really going to help them thrive. And it's not a thing that as a clinician, you really want to say, okay, yeah, you know what I mean? It's not workable.
I have one little follow-up to that I'm curious about. And it's, well, I don't need to preamble it. It's something I'm curious about.
Yeah.
I would imagine sometimes, I mean, there's a certain delicacy to the whole notion of the past and its influence on the present. There's a certain, different people resonate with that idea at different frequencies, some very, very strongly, whether they think that's helpful for themselves or not.
Sure.
Some people might feel, yeah, I would love to sort of reframe the past, move out of it, but you don't get it. It drowns me. It overwhelms me at times, or I feel sort of inexorably stuck in it somehow, right? And I say that as someone who has experienced that and sometimes continues to experience that. And so I'm wondering, I would imagine, I know you, and you're a thoughtful, sensitive person, and you're humanistic, and you're, certainly not out to like tough love anyone out of their feelings. That's not the impression I've gotten from you.
Right.
And so I wonder, is there space for that? I guess is what I'm asking. Is there space for sort of a unique sensitivity to relations with the past? And even if the person recognizes it doesn't serve them, right? But it just is, right?
Always. I'm not ever thinking in absolutes. And so I'm glad you asked. That's a good way to parse this. I would never say to someone, look, I know that's been tough for you, but eventually we need to grow out of it. It's just that's not part of my vernacular. People can, if someone says their past experience is so salient that it bogs them down, then I take them at their word, and I just assume that that's the truth. And I guess that what I'm trying to say is my job isn't to try to get him to try to tell him one thing or another about that experience. My job is to say, what do you want to do about this?
Mhm.
What are the situations? How, in what ways does it bog you down? Would you like it to be a little bit more fluid and easy to navigate those situations? Given that this has happened, what are some ways you might be able to do it, and or what would you need in order to make this a more fluid and better and easier process? And so, you know what I mean? So it's like
Yeah.
you use anything everybody gives you, not as ammunition against them, but as just as something that informs you about them. We just want to be careful to remind each other and other people who practice in a helping profession that no one should play God. And so
Mm.
no one should say, okay, now I understand because you've told me this. Here's what I think you should do. It just doesn't work that way. No matter
Mhm.
how much we want to do it, no matter how nice it sounds, no matter how saleable that is, no matter how confidently someone says it, just not the way it works. You can
Mm.
help a person see things from a perspective that's different than the one they've put forward, but not by giving them, inserting or infusing different information or some authoritative sort of idea to them.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, the only question I have left, at least on this subject, the heading of values and that sort of thing, the only question I have left is what something I wanted to include as part of our soon to be famous segment, Stump Stanton, which we need. You're a musician, I'm a musician. We need to come up with some kind of jingle, I think, for Stump Stanton. But I suppose that question really ought to be asked with Stanton's sort of direct involvement. But it's related to what we just talked about, and maybe I can just pose it here. You don't even necessarily have to answer it, or maybe we can get Stanton on the line at some point and hear his answer to it. I hear Stanton often speak about, in fact, it seems to be one of the things he gravitates to most strongly. I think he would agree with that. These sort of formative moments that happen between parents and children. And now Stanton is always talking about them in a positive way,
Mm-hmm.
almost always, at least.
Mm-hmm.
He has a lot of, again, when he introduces you to somebody, he'll often share, when this guy was 10 years old, his dad said such and such, and then he did X, Y, and Z as a result. Or that informed part of how his life developed. And what I would try to stump Stanton with, so to speak, is this idea that if positive parenting can have this extremely dramatic influence, is it not also true that negative parenting, of course, does? And I know he would acknowledge the validity of that, but it's almost framed in such a way that positive parenting creates positive living, I guess you could say, or a certain kind of positive parenting. And I think the certain kind that appeals to Stanton, and it appeals to me too, is sort of clear, direct, maybe a bit of sensitivity, but not too much sensitivity, right? Like just the right amount of, you're a human being and I love you no matter what, but you also got to get your shit together. You know what I mean? Like that sort of line. And I'd be curious to know what you or Stanton or both think about. Is there more weight given to that than given to what we all sort of would recognize as either neglective or abusive parenting, right? And if so, what are we supposed to do about that?
Okay, two things. One, I don't think we'll stump Stanton with this. I get
Of
what
course,
you're saying.
I know.
I get what you're saying. It's if traumatic events in your interaction with your parents, or like a long-term negative, adverse sort of relationship with parents, isn't the be all end all, or isn't supposed to inform what you do in your life, then why is the exact same, the opposite persuasion, but the same emphasis placed on positive parenting? And why do you think so good, or why talk about that so much? Why does that inform your conversation so often? I think I know what he would say, and I agree with him. What he would say is that if you've taken away positive messages from your parenting, but it's not more really the positive messages, it's more like, what kind of space did your parent give you to grow up? And how did they help foster your growth and development? If you remember things in, overwhelmingly positive and optimistic terms about that, it gives you a structure to kind of follow and remember. And you could always go against it. You could always sort of become an anarchist against whatever you think that was your best positive memory. But, why do that? So his whole thing is like, if something positive happens and it's helping you and it's pushing you forward, why not glue yourself to that? Don't limit yourself by it. Don't say, well, my dad said this about me, and he said I could be a good doctor someday, and so never try to do anything else besides be a doctor. That's more like the idea of you witnessed someone who believed in you, or you saw someone who lived their own values, so it was a good role model. And so if you have that structure and it's interesting to you and it helps you feel optimistic about yourself and your abilities, then that's a very good thing. Okay, so as for why focus on that and not focus on the traumatic? You could have an equally negative experience with your parents. Well, the thing is, you can always generate a new experience. And sometimes when you survive a shitty experience, you almost have even though you'd never prescribe it, you would never say, you know what you need, a good shitty experience. You kind of have a perspective when you go through that helps you build. You at least have a hell to run away from. And the idea I think he would put forward is that you're never doomed. You can always, if what you want is if you had a bad relationship with your parents, let's say, and what you want is a positive relationship, there are always ways to do that. And you're not going to get to those things by stewing over your bad relationships or believing that because you had bad ones that now you can't. You're going to do it by thinking about, all right, what tools do you have at your disposal? Why don't I want what that thing was? And, how can I move forward? So in his eyes, maybe there is sort of an equality to those things, but it's like, why harbor the negativity? And why not remind yourself of the positivity if it's going to move you forward? Why not lean on things that are positive? Don't limit yourself by them. I think that's what he would say. But why only stew on things that are negative? And why believe that because things happened that were negative, you couldn't possibly make something of yourself? That doesn't.
All right, so
I have a sense that doesn't totally fulfill your curiosity or your.
No, it does. It does actually. I think it does. I mean, I first of all, I'm crestfallen that I didn't even come close to stumping Stanton, but I'll continue to, try to think of ways to stump him. But no, I think that does more or less, sort of explain I guess I can no longer call it a discrepancy. It's not really a discrepancy. It's sort of a perspective, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah. Right.
What do I pay attention to?
Right.
Given that I have the choice of what to pay attention to.
Right. Exactly.